Okay, welcome back to the Modern Revolution. My name's Pete Deely. Thanks for tuning in again, so to speak. As you know, on our podcast here, we don't spend a lot of time talking about the guests before we get into our conversation, sort of establishing the authority of why you should listen. Instead, we invite you just to listen deeply. And as we come to the end of the podcast, we'll tell you about the other places that you can learn about them and get to know them more deeply. My good luck continues yet again. I have a fascinating guest, Mr. John Lawyer. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Peter. I really appreciate it.
And John, when we begin here, often we like to start with just the notion of, what problem in the world are you tackling in your work? What problem are you trying to solve out there?
I'm looking at how people can be in touch with themselves spiritually, which I think is fiercely independent to each person,
Right?
and how they can intersect that with this real world that we all share and live in and walk through every day. Because I think that's such an important kind of crossroads.
So, in your coming to sort of valuing the spiritual part of our existence as important enough to kind of use your energy to get other people to value it there, could you talk to us a little bit about how that became important to you?
Sure. I spent most of my youth, the first 15 years of my adult life, in and out of combat zones, overseas, Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan. I think 12 years between those places and a couple more.
Hmm.
And so I was at war. I was from right before 9/11 on, and I think that was this experience where I was busy. I was doing something I believed in. I was doing something I was idealistically attached to.
Right?
I was working 100, 110 hours a week, 7 days a week, years on end. That's pretty intense stuff.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I think that experience kind of it showed me some very positive things. It showed me some very dark things.
Yeah.
It showed me the darkness of the universe and the world. And I was part of that big military industrial complex machine uh, that does some good. I mean, there's some things that it does in the world that's probably a good thing, but it's does a lot of bad too. And I was part of it. And so I think seeing that darkness for a while, that's all I saw. But then it gave me contrast eventually, where I was able to see more light and the
Yeah.
greatness of the light and also the balance of the two. So I think that was part of where I've come from. You know,
So 15 years is a very long time. And it's particularly at when you began that journey. And Brene Brown often talks about empathy and all the rest of it, and how in life that's super important and useful, minus the soldier's time, because in the theater of war, there are objectives that you can't afford to have quite the same level of connection to the people that you're affecting out there, the enemy, so as you would in other parts of your life. So I'm curious, as you were in this extraordinary long intense period of time, were you experiencing this turning towards how important the spiritual part of your life was in the mix of all of that intensity? Or did that happen after you had some distance between that intense experience and then coming to the realization? I'm curious if those seeds were being watered as you went along, or they had to lie dormant because you couldn't afford to have them blossom at that time.
uh, that's a great question, and I think that I would say it's two parts.
Okay.
I think the seeds were planted, yes, and I think there was some water there. I think most of it happened after, but I would say that you know I'm not into politics, but philosophically, war is this political thing, right? And I think
Sure.
started to see that in the
Hmm.
truth of war. I started to see the humanistic aspect of my oneness with this person that I was trying to kill
Right.
or capture. And so I realized that they were just living their life just like I was. They were trying to take care of their family and their tribe just like I was. And neither one of us was really in control of why we were there and what we were doing.
Right.
And neither were the civilians or the citizens that were innocent on either side, on the middle, in the middle of either side. And so I think that I increasingly saw the human toll that it took on the enemy, quote unquote enemy, on I saw the human toll that it took on ourselves, like my brothers and sisters in arms, and that this machine was grinding us up for, very little purpose. I think that led me down a path that opened my mind and caused me to think more critically and see the this humanistic oneness of all things. So I think that's where the seeds were kind of planted.
Right.
And and I think also being dedicated to a cause, whether you're a soldier, professional athlete, or an artist completely dedicated to your craft, when you're completely dedicated to something, I
Right.
think there's something very spiritual about that. So
Yes,
I
I
was
agree.
completely dedicated to my job. Yeah. So I would, that's kind of my answer to that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in what you just said. And did you go into that experience with a framework in place that was given to you as a child that allowed you to think beyond the moment? Because the intensity of a 100-hour work week, which is almost impossible for, to think about. I mean, you're not sleeping at all, more or less, right? I mean, or if you're sleeping incredibly little. So your human experience in the midst of this long battle is one of constant movement, it sounds to me, and the chance to reflect in the midst of constant movement with lethal consequences if you're not, totally accurate in what you're doing, wouldn't leave a lot of time to be exploring new things, is what I would imagine. So as you entered into that experience, was there something given to you in your upbringing that allowed for that to occur to you? Because if these seeds were watered along the way, then you had to have some notion that what you're doing has implications beyond the moment, right? That
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a really astute question. And I love the idea that you almost don't have time to think, because that's a good way to put it. Um, my parents were very progressive. They were very liberal thinkers.
Mhm.
I was raised Southern Baptist because their parents were both Southern Baptist, but they weren't. I went to church and all that, but it wasn't the same as it had been for them.
Okay.
So I was taught philosophy. I was taught the God of many names. Like, yeah, Christian, but there's all these other people that aren't going to hell. They're cool,
Right, right, right. Yeah, right.
that kind of thing. Uh, I would come home from Sunday school after an afternoon and morning the First Baptist Church, and I would kind of have lunch, and my parents would ask me what I was taught in Sunday school, and I realized years later they were just deprogramming me um,
Yeah,
from
right.
that, from the politics of it, from the dogma of it.
Sure.
Um, so yeah, my parents were very, very much that I would read a lot, that I would educate myself, and be this forward thinking, open minded person.
So there's a lot of fascinating things in what you just said there, because to me it's that they had a framework that they saw the spiritual world. It was a Christian framework, but that framework wasn't rigid, is what it sounds like to me. That, like, this is a framework by which we approach the world, and it means a lot to us, but not so much that they're like, hey, we exclude people who don't have our framework from the notion that they are good people with the benefits of the divine smiling on them too. I mean, is that a fair kind of paraphrase of?
That's fair. And my dad didn't really go to the church much. He would go every now and then, but mostly it was my mom. And my dad was more into philosophy. But my
Okay.
mom still talked about the God of many names. So it was also, I had each parent also provided their own contrast to that as
Interesting.
well.
Yeah. Because it would seem to me in the theater of war, where often younger people, often younger men, are sent to do jobs in which those jobs are not fleshed out as the why. I mean, what's the expression? It's not for me to question why, but to do or die, I think, is like the famous
Yeah.
expression throughout history. Um, and I probably misquoted it. However, the reason why I ask is that that invites a rigid thinking that, listen, we're just here to do what they say to do, and we can't question it, because if we question it, we put, both ourselves as individuals and our collective brothers and sisters at risk. However, it sounds to me like as you went along, you found room in that to say, like, well, maybe these instructions and jobs are at counter purposes with who I want to be in the world, or, as you say, the military industrial complex did not always serve you and your brothers and sisters and us as a society properly. I mean, is that so? I guess I'm drawing a parallel, and I don't know if I'm accurate about it, but
No, that's a good point, and I can give you a specific story. I ask why a lot. I was actually kind of a rebel in the
okay,
army.
okay,
It was difficult at times.
I would imagine.
Um, but I was this motivated young enlisted soldier, and I didn't have much rank, but I was really good at my job, and so they would send me places to talk to the embassy and talk to three-letter agencies and do all that stuff.
Wow.
And um, when I walked into a room, even as an E4, people would listen. It was great. Even as a 22-year-old kid. In fact, I got stopped in the hallway once, and someone was like, "Are you a dependent? Are you someone's kid?" And I was like, "No, I'm a soldier." I was in civilian clothes,
Yeah,
so.
yeah.
Um, but I ran across the head civilian of our military brigade. He was like almost like a colonel equivalent civilian,
Hmm.
and there was this thing that I thought we should do because it was the right thing to do, which it would help people. And and he's like, we're not going to do that. And I was arguing with him, which you're not supposed to do. And he's like
Right.
lawyer, and he yelled at me like really loud. He's like, it's not about doing what's right. It's about power.
Hmm.
So
That's fascinating.
even so there's these fiefdoms in the military and in the intelligence community,
Okay.
and whether you watch the looming tower or whatever, right? Like you can see it even in stuff that's been published in TV shows that are out there. They're the accurate portrayals of how we ended up with 9/11 or whatever. Like it's this very tribal thing.
So,
Um,
just from a point of clarification, when we're talking about when he yelled at you that it's about power, he wasn't talking per se about power between us and the enemy. He's talking about power within the context of the military industrial complex, and that
the
if
100
you if
100%.
you act outside the strengthening of his particular fiefdom, you're compromising his level of power. And regardless of how good that is for the soldiers on the ground, that person's not
Yeah,
willing to do it. Is that pretty much what you just told me?
that is 100% what I just told you.
Yeah, that is
Yeah.
I don't think that it's possible for those of us that have not been in those circumstances to appreciate what you just said, because it seems impossible, I think, for those of us outside, that somebody could make a decision to put people's lives at risk to keep their own fiefdom intact, especially, when we're talking about it's only one fiefdom internal to our own military industrial complex and another fiefdom within the same complex. Um,
Yes.
do you, and I don't, and I'm not looking to sensationalize uh, our conversation with something tragic. However, I am curious, like that's a real specific moment that if I was in your shoes at 22, it would have levered me closer to like, well, what exactly am I doing? Was there
Yes.
other experiences that, like, as you weighed the magnitude of what was going on, and 22 is super super young, I mean,
Yeah.
and at
Yeah.
22 to 42, whatever, you're still a young person. Were there experiences in which that contrast between what you were really doing and what you thought you should be doing, like, are really obviously different?
Yeah, that moment changed my life.
Okay.
That moment
Yeah.
changed. I knew instantly that I couldn't go back to the Beltway in Washington D.C. and
Yeah.
try to work. I'd always kind of wanted to do the Jack Ryan thing and and love
Yeah.
Tom Clancy. I
Yeah.
instantly realized I can't go work in the Beltway. I can't do it,
Right.
and that's why. So it kept me gravitating towards being as far away from the flagpole as you can be, as they say.
Okay.
So I wanted to be as far away from headquarters as I could get and still be relevant.
Okay.
And so that's why I ended up at Camp Doha in Kuwait or in Baghdad or in Kandahar, Afghanistan, because it's as far away as I could get from the machine's brain. And
Okay.
like, uh, and it shaped the way I started to see things consistently. I started to be consistently let down by the people who are making decisions, and it started to realize, okay, what we're doing, okay, we myself, a bunch of other smart people say, hey, you should go get this bad guy.
Right.
Oh, we're not going to get that bad guy for political reasons.
Right.
Well, this guy's going to kill a lot of people. And like, I mean, he's a really bad guy. Like, not like tactical bad, like strategically bad guy.
Right.
And you start to see like, oh, okay, well, the Bush doctrine or whatever it is, that's just theater, right?
Right.
That's just, we're not going to go get them. We're not going to, that's just what we're saying we're going to do. We're not actually going to go do it.
What, so is it, and I want to come back to like some of the places you have been because I think me and many, many other people listening, our knowledge of those places and those experiences are effectively given to us through Hollywood, and that our what we think those places and experiences were like are like there are very, very few of us that have the opportunity to talk to somebody who's really been in those shoes. But based on what you just said in terms of the theater of politics and the reality of political and military objectives, how do you boil it down to? I mean, are the things being told to the soldiers on the ground effectively just designed to keep things spinning as they are without looking for a resolution? Or do they look for irrelevant resolutions as a way to mask, like, look, we just want this to continue to go?
I Yeah, that's a good question. I think that soldiers are told whatever they need to be told to get the soldiers to do what they want them to do.
Right.
And if that's, it's propaganda, it's friendly psychological operations. What it is. I don't want to paint the military industrial complex as this giant conspiratorial machine because at the same time, it's two things. Two things can be true. It's really good at what it does. It's really effective. It does some amazing things, and it's also really disorganized.
Okay.
And there is no central conspiracy. It's this thing that happens almost as a consequence of a bunch of things happening. So it's not like now don't get me wrong, sometimes they say let's make this happen.
Hmm.
Let's give this perception um and knowing it's not true. That does happen, but it's not always as malicious as it would sound.
Right.
Oftentimes it's just the way things happen and fall out and the machine makes itself move forward. It almost like it moves on its own without any one single person moving it, if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, it does from a theoretical perspective. It makes sense to me in that there seems to be ethics that organizations have, and those ethics are an aggregate of decisions and behavior over time. And that if you want to change the ethic of a place, it often takes a contrarian, a very brave contrarian to do anything radical. And I think that happens very infrequently in all organizations, not just the military industrial complex. Or, then an ethic changes organically with little tiny decisions over time. And so my guess is you're not the only one in the world to be a part of that system that would like to kind of reorient it. So in my mind, what happens is that either there are more people like John, lawyer, who change things over time, and that it's a gradual, incremental process, or there's some really strong contrarian that comes in and can abruptly. But it's such a big thing,
Yeah.
sort of like the U.S. government. I think in general, I mean, it's such a giant organism that it when people talk about conspiracies, and I have relatives that work within the federal government, I was like, well, there's it's not really one steering wheel that sits atop this whole thing that somebody's got their finger on and turning it this way and that. Um, Maybe you could give a story, if you would, about um, a place like Kandahar, because when you talk about being far away, many of us, American citizens generally are not the most well-traveled human beings on the planet, right? So a lot of us haven't been, and if we've been somewhere, we've been someplace familiar. We've been either back to where our family immigrated from, Europe or wherever. But Kandahar is not like many places in the United States. So maybe you could tell a story about being there.
Yeah, that was 6.5 years of my life consecutive there. So it was a big part of my life. It's the high desert. It's on the right on the edge of one of the biggest deserts in the world,
Hmm.
the Rig Desert, and it's at 3,000 feet. It's pretty high elevation. There's mountains all around it, but it's still kind of flat where we were. Where we were only, I think, 40 miles from Pakistan. We were really close to Pakistan, which is
Right,
where all the Taliban would go back to hang out
right,
and all the bad guys, quote unquote bad guys.
sure.
Um, and you know, I would describe Afghanistan, especially well, most of it, but it's like the Middle Ages with cell phones and cars. I
Okay.
mean, there's people
That's
literally
interesting.
living
Yeah.
in mud huts. Like they're well constructed buildings, but they're made of mud.
Right.
There's no addresses, there's no courthouse, there's no records, there's no anything. I mean,
Right.
so reframe everything that you know about society. And in Kandahar, I was at Kandahar Airfield, which was in a rural area, but about, I don't know, 7, 8, 10 miles north was Kandahar city of about 1 million people, depending on who you ask.
Right.
There's no census.
Sure.
And, and it's a bustling city, but it's still got compounds made out of mud, some more modern building materials, but it's completely backwards. That Afghans don't think about the world or life like anyone else anywhere else in the world. I mean, it's like when an Afghan would look at you, it wasn't like they were looking at you like that they would beat you or that, it's like they would look at us like we'd already lost. They knew it and we're just waiting for
What
the
is,
inevitable to occur.
so can you maybe describe that a little more clearly? Like, so
Sure.
when you talk about an Afghan, we're talking about this is a person living in a context that's nothing like the context that most of the people listening to this live in, and you're a combat, I don't know how you would define a combatant, a soldier on the other end of this conflict. And when they look at you, even though they're coming from a context of a less technologically advanced living arrangement, whatnot, they look at you as if this is that ordinary person is looking at you going, it's just a matter of time before you're out of here, and our victory is sort of asserted. Is that, I mean, what does that mean in practice?
Yeah, that's absolutely what it was like. And it wasn't, they were nice people. They were
Hmm.
different approach to life coming from a completely different perspective, but they cared that we were there. They also didn't care that we were there. It's a very because Islam is so important to them, but in Afghanistan more than anywhere that I've ever experienced, the tribes are Afghanistan's. So Islam almost takes a back seat to the tribal structure in
Okay.
Afghanistan. And and also those frontier provinces in Pakistan that the central Pakistan government doesn't have control over. It's very tribalistic. And I mean, you've got tribes and sub-tribes and sub-tribes of sub-tribes, and that dominates everything.
So are
And
those
so
organized around familiar relationships? I mean, when we talk about, we use that term tribe, but I mean, these are actual tribes, we'll use that term metaphorically more often than not. So are these groups of people organized around
blood, yeah,
blood?
blood tribes,
And then, I mean, are we talking about hundreds of people, thousands of people? I mean, what's a
millions of people, millions,
million
hundreds of that, yeah,
might identify with a particular tribe?
the whole country,
The whole, oh,
the
okay. Okay.
the entire country, whether you're in the Kandahar in the south with the Pashtuns and where the Taliban started, or if you're in the north with like Rashid Dostum and I mean, like, people probably don't know who that is, but the point is like there's all these different, and it's super ethnically diverse, so it's
Okay.
not just one ethnic group, but
Right.
it's still tribes, and
Okay.
it governs everything that happens goes down to that, which is really interesting to be a part of, to watch. It's fascinating, that because they live at this very blood-based familial level, and that hasn't changed for, I mean, we're talking thousands of years.
So from a sense of justice and law and like how to treat when things, I mean, those, everything works fine when everybody's in agreement, but when there's a disagreement, is is the system of adjudication where somebody is considered to be breaking a rule consistent in any way from tribe to tribe, or are you basically in a different country every time you're in a different tribe's presence? I mean,
You're essentially in a different country every time.
wow.
It's I mean, there's consistency across from an Islamic perspective because they still follow Islam,
Okay.
but the tribe still trumps Islam. They won't tell you that, but it does.
Okay.
And so yeah, it depends on, it definitely depends on which tribe, if you commit an infraction against their society, against them, their culture, their community, what the result or consequence is of that will definitely depend on what tribe that you're surrounded by.
Wow. So you don't know if you got a parking ticket or you've committed a capital offense,
Yeah, it's true.
depending,
Yeah.
I mean, depending
Yeah.
on who you're around.
That's true.
when 6.5 years is a long time, what might have been the biggest perspective shift from the beginning of that experience to the end? And is there one emblematic story that, like, when this happened, I really understood what was going on? Because when you showed up, there's no way you knew what was going on. I mean, compared
No,
to
I didn't.
when you left, right? Like, you show up in this world that's very unlike any other place on earth.
Yeah. When I first showed up, I didn't understand Afghanistan. I still don't like they do, obviously, but
Sure.
I understand it way better than I did.
Yeah.
And I think that the lesson that I learned, yeah, that's a really hard question.
Hmm.
But I will tell you, I would say that the thing that I learned the most, this is probably going to be a weird answer, was how hard it is. Like, we knew what to do. People that were there for a long time, people that were smart about Afghanistan, we knew what could be done to stop the insurgency, to help the people. Uh, I mean, there's a statistic that people say that the only thing that matters in an insurgency is the unemployment rate of military age males from the age 16 to 54. If those men have jobs, they're not
Oh,
going to fight you,
that's interesting.
you know.
Yeah.
And but we weren't creating jobs. We weren't
Right.
build we weren't we weren't building power plants to get power to them all.
Yeah.
We were building schools and we were doing digging wells and we were doing all this humanitarian aid, giving them rice and beans, but we weren't spending all this money that we could have spent on what could have mattered. So there was no intent. There was no definition of victory, so you can't win.
Right.
You don't define, and there was no intent to actually fundamentally change the way that things were happening. It was possible, but there was no intent to do it. And part of your question made me really think about why.
Hmm.
And I was there for 6.5 years, but every 6 to 18 months, usually 6 to 12 months, I would see a whole new set of men and women around me
Sure.
who were convinced that they were going to come in and reinvent the wheel every 6 to 12 months.
Yes. Right. Must have been
And
exhausting.
oh my God, it is so exhausting. And they'd be like, well, why can't we do this? They're shooting rockets at us. Well, why don't we, put a predator up, a drone, and find them before they shoot the rocket at us? I'm like, guys, you don't think we've thought of that? They shoot
Right.
rockets at us. Like, I live on this base. They try to kill me. You
Right.
don't think that I've thought about that to try to stop, and it's not just, but like there's all this, and that's just one example, but I'm talking about like learning about the tribes and how the tribe, like this conversation you and I just had,
Right.
having someone accept that, it's having, and so there was they call when units come in and deploy into the country and deploy out, they call it ripping in and ripping out.
Okay.
And I think that's such a good way to say it because it is a rip, it is a tear,
Right. It's not a
and it's
gentle
not subtle.
experience.
It's not
Not subtle.
subtle.
All right. Yeah.
So I would say it was that reinventing of the wheel every 6 to 12 months was, in watching it happen, it was really this frustrating process to watch and a really interesting lesson in human behavior.
I mean, this is Sisyphus writ large, right? I mean, every 12 to 18 months,
Yeah,
right? You are going through the
push the
same
boulder up.
conversations. You're
Yeah,
pushing a boulder up, that thing rolls back
yeah.
down. Here comes the next group. It's another boulder. I mean, when you um I'm sure you have, like, wondered why you're alive. I mean, given all of those years of threat. Um, from Hollywood, it would seem that it was luck rather than it was skill. So can you a- and I'm taking this conversation way off course than my plan, so forgive me for meandering,
No,
but
this is
it,
fine. This is perfectly fine.
it feels to me like, or let me put it another way. When I consume the information that is given to me, it feels as though the arbitrariness of the violence in Afghanistan was such that you could protect yourself to an extent, but beyond that, there was a unpredictable, arbitrary level of violence that found whoever it found at the time. And so it wasn't just the quick and the dead, right? I mean, it was like, well, right place or wrong, right place, wrong time, or whatever metaphor you might want to give to dying because you were in the wrong circumstance. I mean, was there a way to rationally live that you could say, I can do my work here and have a reasonable expectation to live through the work? Or was it a constant level of like, oh my goodness, today may be the last day?
No, it wasn't ever like today could be the last day. There was always yes and no. Like
Okay.
there was always that thought, yeah, today could be the day that a truck bomb goes off and kills me, or a rocket hits the compound. In Kuwait it was ballistic missiles that Saddam fired, like Scud type stuff. In
Right.
in in Iraq it was IEDs on routes and stuff. In Afghanistan, I was on a pretty big base, but
Okay.
it did get attacked. And like one time a truck bomb drove off. It was 400 meters from our compound, the perimeter of the base, 400 meters, and it blew up, and it was a big explosion. It threw big pieces of metal into our compound and almost cut a guy in half. Sorry, I don't know if I can say that.
Sure. Yeah, you can say that.
But it didn't high order. There was a bigger explosion. There was this 5,000-gallon propane tank, one of those giant propane tanks you see on trucks.
Right.
They hadn't welded a valve shut that they needed to. And so it didn't high order. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you right now. It would have been the largest truck bomb in the history of
Oh my
the
God.
world. Um, so that was sobering. So there was this idea that yeah, and a rocket could come in. They rocketed us, but our unit's job was to stop that stuff from happening.
Right.
Like so, I was in a unique position, and my unit was in it. The guys and gals that I worked with, we were all in a unique position to save ourselves.
That's interesting.
Um, which is an interesting mission. And uh, so I think that helped me move through it because and it wasn't just that we were protecting ourselves. There were 50,000 people on base. There are billions of dollars worth of aircraft. And at that time, Kandahar Airfield was the single busiest one runway on planet Earth. So
Okay.
it
Wow.
had to stay green. We had to keep it open.
Yeah.
Because we were in a landlocked country in the middle of a war.
The I interviewed for a podcast I have called the Jiu-Jitsu Mindset, a Marine named Julian Torres. And Julian Torres is a young man, gets trained to be a Marine, gets deployed. On day 23 of his deployment, steps on an IED and has both of his legs blown off. And in that conversation, sort of the arbitrariness of the violence was really hard to kind of get out of my head because you have this young man's life leading up to volunteering to be put in harm's way, and then harm's way finds him immediately in in his deployment, and his life has changed. He lives to tell the tale, but he's come back and he's a double amputee, and his life is very unique, in terms of how he goes day to day, and he carries this change in his life with extraordinary grace. And so 6.5 years of that sort of vigilance, and then having every 18 months somebody come in and tell you why you should have to rethink everything you just learned for the last, however long there, must have been fatiguing on both a physical level and a psychological level as well. If you were there for 6.5 years, you probably had a say in staying, because I'd imagine just like everybody else was rotating in and out after 12 months or 18 months, you must have been in somehow picking to stay there.
I Yeah, I was a civilian by that point. I had finished my enlistment, and by that point, I was a
Okay.
civilian doing the same type job. But yeah, it was a choice.
So what
So
levers you out? Like when do you cry uncle and get out of there?
that's a good question. I flamed out. I completely burnt out. Um, Myself and another guy that I worked with that in our unit. We didn't really need us anymore. The base was really safe. You could just loot.
Okay.
We'd completely changed things. We're really good at what we did.
Right.
And we got fired. They said that we don't need you anymore.
Okay.
Um, have a nice day. And it was it was a tough process because it's like, oh, I'm not needed anymore. So yeah, I flamed out. I didn't have anything left.
The pinnacle of success was to make your job irrelevant, and then you kind of achieved that, and now your identity must have, because you had such a relentless
Yeah.
experience. I mean, when you're on that plane out of there for the last time, I mean, when we talk about needing to find your spiritual bearings, like when you're on your way out of there, do you have any sense of what's going on with you, or are you numb to the experience? Like, can you feel anything at that juncture, or are you just in shock?
I was in shock. The morning I flew out, when I went to go say goodbye to my unit, I cried like a baby.
Sure. Yeah.
Cause I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what was I gonna go do? Like
Yeah.
I, I, I didn't know I was a war junkie. I didn't know how to do anything else.
Right.
And I was like, I was gonna go from like telling planes where to go and sending and telling men which compound to go hit and all this stuff, this big stuff that I thought was big stuff, right?
Sure.
I was just, I was gonna go from that to nothing. And so no, I was in shock. I didn't know what to expect. I was completely lost, had no identity. So that, yeah, I was completely and wholly lost.
So when you have this long, extraordinary, intense experience that has your full attention. So if you're a Buddhist, this is a single point meditation that lasts for 15 years, right? So
Yeah.
you don't have a choice other than to be entirely focused on the moment, which is, as you talk about there, the artist, the professional athlete, the holy monk, I mean, one commonality is that ability to be totally present to the circumstance. But now that circumstance sort of evaporates, and you on the one level have to pick, like, well, where are you going to put your attention? So as you get ripped out and start to come into a different reality, um, where does, to kind of begin to tie things back into this notion of you looking to work with people to help them connect to the spiritual part of their life as being
Right.
important. What's the journey from that sort of blender of experiences that don't allow for you to kind of pick your identity or identify with something other than your job, into where we're headed now?
Yeah. The next 7 years after that, I really was lost. I didn't have an idea. I started to, time helps a lot of things.
Right.
I started to finally eventually being able to, because I had complex PSD, I had
Sure.
obsessive compulsive depression, anxiety, hypervigilance. I mean, you name it. Like it's the
Yeah.
buffet
Yeah.
of all of that,
How could you not?
So part of it was just I was sad that this had happened to me. Like I had given like every cell of my body
Right.
and my being to
Yeah.
my country, to my mission, to my unit, to my mission. I felt a little betrayed. I was jaded for a long time. I
Sure.
finally got to some acceptance with that, but then I'm jaded because it's not just the mental part. My back's messed up. I
Sure.
have Gulf War syndrome and I have migraines and all this physical stuff that is
Yeah.
and in my brain, my amygdala is used to adrenaline and that like we talked about that single focus that's not there anymore. So that's an aspect that's both mental and physical crossover.
Yeah.
And so I was completely busted just from a mind, body, soul perspective.
Right.
So I watched a lot of television. I
Yeah.
played video games. I
Yeah.
played video games, the player versus player, just to try to light that spark a little bit.
Sure.
As dumb as that sounds.
No, I think that's part of the reason
And
why those things are what they are, right? There's
yeah,
some linkage, as distant as it might be, but it's just like movies of violence. Like, why do we see movies of violence be so popular? It
yeah.
gives us a link to it without having to do it. But so in this length of time in which you have physical ramifications of that experience, psychological, spiritual, what is there a moment of lever that says, okay, I have a new way to frame thinking about the rest of my life and thinking about me? Or is it just so slow that it just happens like day after day, you move a little bit in a different direction?
I had a day where I decided that I wasn't going to care anymore. Not about like taking my own life or anything. Just like, I'm like, I don't care anymore. Like, I'm tired of being invested in all this stuff. I just don't care what happens.
Okay.
And that wasn't spiritual. That was more of like, I just don't care. And after 2 or 3 years, that I think that started the process with some, along with some other things that had happened in my life that tied together, that were snowballs rolling down that came together and formed a bigger snowball, and that led me to my moment over 2 years ago now, where I had this spiritual moment of understanding, great clarity. People call it awakening.
Okay.
This idea of a oneness with the universe, loving kindness, that we are.
Mhm.
I wanted to help people. I knew my dharma was, my higher purpose was to go help people help themselves find their wholeness, even if they couldn't see it, their light, even if they couldn't feel that light. And so that moment is where everything changed for me, and it was in an instant.
Was it levered by something external, or was it just the divine just kind of poked you in the forehead and said, "Hey, here it is"?
That same year that it happened, in 2021, earlier in the year, I had shingles at a very young age. I was on 39. I got shingles in my left eye and on my left side of my face from here over. And I lost part of I was lucky. The VA treated me quite well, but I lost part of the vision in my left eye, not a lot, but enough. And I also got this big scar right here where my third eye would be, in between my eyebrows.
How
And
interesting.
it'll always
That's
be there.
yeah, that's perfect.
I think that had something to do with it.
Yeah.
And that was a few months before I kind of had my wake up moment.
When I've been following for the last 12 or 15 years some of the conversation around psychedelic drugs as therapeutics. And
Sure.
one of the things that I found interesting in that conversation was our willingness to experiment with people who have terminally ill diseases and people whose death was imminent. Among the first people that John Hopkins and other places would sort of allow for this to be a therapy that they could then treat as an experiment, like, well, what happens? And so among the things that I have heard about, read about, is the notion of people right on the, where of their death is imminent, taking these drugs, these, and coming to a similar realization and it relaxing them. So while death is within a year of these people's lives, they have these experiences, they feel connected to everything and all of it, and it takes away the anxiety of death. So when I listen to you say, listen, I decided I didn't care anymore, which sounds to me like a capitulation of sorts, and
Yeah.
then shortly thereafter a relaxation into, oh, my experience is a part of, my drop of water is in the ocean of all of our experiences, seeming to relax some of that tension that must have been in your amygdala and every muscle of your body, I mean, all of that. Um, so once you pivoted into a different frame of mind, like, what were the hallmarks of the pivot?
Well, my whole life changed. My whole being changed. Like suddenly I was this burnout warrior or whatever I was, and
Right,
now I'm this like filled up person that's on a spirit, unintentional. I mean, I think we're on a journey whether we know it or not. Now I know I'm on the journey,
right.
and
Yes,
so I could appreciate the dark for what it was, and I can see the light. I can know that I'm walking that gray in the middle, the kind of that balance between the yin and the yang, right, of Taoism. And
sure.
I I saw the balance of it all. I saw that we're all connected, and that if I am that and you are that, we are that together. And that I felt like if there's anything that I could do to make anyone's journey easier than mine had been, uh, then I should do that. And I thought that I should also give back to the world, because I've been part of this military industrial complex, done all these dark things.
Sure.
That I could give back to the world as well, in a meaningful way. And that regardless, I felt in an instant, I felt that it doesn't matter if you're a spiritualist, an atheist, a Hindu, a Christian, Muslim. We're all saying the same thing,
Hmm.
even if you're a philosopher, whatever. Like, it's all pointing the same direction. If you read all the books, they overlap. It's all the same stuff.
Yeah.
Science, what
Yeah.
consciousness is, and what Max Planck said about quantum, the father of quantum physics, said about consciousness being fundamental, even though they can't explain it, they know it exists, and it's under matter.
Right.
It sits under everything. So whoever you are, scientist, atheist, religious, spiritualist, doesn't matter. Like, we can have a conversation, ask good questions, find better answers, practice our own individual, unique spiritual idea right next to each other.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's Joseph Campbell. So I'm sure you're familiar with Joseph Campbell
Sure.
and the Hero of a Thousand Faces, and that the all of the stories and myths and spiritual stories of the world look so extraordinarily similar that it cannot be by accident. So when you go to seek, or when people come to work with you and you go to work with people, your point of reference is not absolutely unique, but it's unique in principle to most of people, right? Are you seeking out people who have come through the same level of intensity, people who've been through the military, people who've been through, or are you working with people that have not had those type of experiences? Like, who are you seeking to help with their spiritual development?
Largely work with people that are just normal people, quote unquote normal.
Yeah,
None of
yeah,
us are
yeah.
normal, but quote
No, I
unquote
get
normal,
it.
right?
Right, right.
Um, but it's just yeah, people who are living their daily lives. Like we don't focus on veterans because there's plenty of people out there helping them.
Okay,
I thought that was a pretty crowded space, and so it's really just to help anybody who's searching for their path or knows it, or maybe that they're trying to move past and let go of their trauma and move forward. And like I said, it's anybody who really wants to connect that, find their spiritual self, identify what it means and is, and then integrate that to their day-to-day life so they can be aligned and live their own unique path, be empowered within themselves and have this joyous existence. Like whether even if a driven professional can have that, or if it's someone that is a stay-at-home parent or someone that is working a blue-collar job, it doesn't matter.
sure. Yeah, well, I think that everybody's experience is in the context of their experience, right? I mean, self-reflexive.
Yeah.
It just is what it is. However, there are differences, and not every like when I think about the difference in poverty. I mean, you come up as a poor person in certain situations, it's different. And those differences can't really be ignored. So when you think about the stress that you've experienced and the things that were traumatic to you, and then people come to you and their amplitude of experience is different. It may not be different to them, but when you look from an outsider, you go, I understand you're upset about these circumstances. But when you see him as less intense than the things you've been to, or maybe you don't, but it would be understandable if, somebody comes to you with a set of issues that, come out of a less intense circumstance. Are you able, or maybe you are now, but in the beginning, were you able to tease apart the comparison of like allowing people to come to you and see it entirely within their reality? Or did you have a or did you have any temptation to want to compare it to your own experience? Both from the standpoint of like, hey, yours is not that bad, or I'm so strong because I've been through this thing, so I can surely help you through your little problem. I mean, I could imagine the seduction of wanting to feel like a spiritual superhero because I've been through 15 years of like what we could be defined as torture if you see it through a certain lens. Does that make sense, or is that fair to ask?
No, no, that's a fair question. It's a fair question, and it's a really good question actually because it's relevant because we're humans.
Sure.
I think the answer is old me,
Hmm.
pre understanding clarity, awakening me would have said, yeah, sure. But now I really live this. I'm not perfect. I'm still human, but I live a very non-judgmental existence now for myself, for others. Um, I don't think that any one trauma is better or worse than the others. I truly believe that I think it goes deeper than just who we are because I think we're walking probably more than one life that we've lived as well. So I can appreciate these people could also have gone through something in their past, like
Interesting.
deep,
Yeah.
deep past.
Okay.
And so I think that everybody has to be looked in at as this unique thing that deserves their own self-love to be loved by the rest of us, and that we have to approach that with non-judgment. They have to approach themselves with self-love, and that I think that I love that you said like, do I if I saw myself as some supernatural or spiritual superhero, right? And I think the answer is that I would say the hero is within them. It's like it's that Mariah Carey song, the hero
Yeah.
lies
Yeah.
in you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's and we're not taught that. we're always taught to be someone else's hero in our society and
Hmm.
culture. We're taught to go save other people. We're never taught to save ourselves.
That's interesting, right?
So
Yeah,
that's my approach to it.
yeah. So, if someone's listening and they're uh, maybe they're understanding it right off the bat, and maybe not. When you think about why people might diminish the importance of being spiritually grounded and connected in the buffet of things that they have to deal with in their lives, like maybe they diminish the importance of their spiritual connection compared to what it actually deserves. Why do you think that happens? Like why do folks um, come to it when in times of extreme situations,
Yeah.
it is often a saving place to put
Yeah.
your energy and attention. But when you're not in those extreme intention, why don't we pay more attention to it than we should?
Because society has conditioned us to uh just do the status quo, go with the flow, do what we're told by our parents, our teachers, our coworkers, our work organization,
Hmm.
our government. And I'm not vilifying any of those things. Those are good
Sure.
things, but we're raised we're raised from childhood to not be children, to lose that magic of childhood, to conform. And I have a word for it, or a phrase. I call it the stream of unconsciousness. It's this
Hmm.
thing that
Yeah,
pulls
yeah,
us down this stream. It can be warm, it can be comfortable, but it's not who we are. Like if we stand up out of that stream, it's not very deep.
yeah,
Stand
yeah.
up, look around, suddenly, oh, this is brighter. There's joy here. There is true peace.
Hmm.
But I think people don't see it because they're so distracted, because we're conditioned to be distracted. We're conditioned to be unmindful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have to say, as you're talking, the word distracted is the word that I can come back to because you couldn't be distracted for so long, and then as that circumstance shatters, you couldn't be focused in a sense because like you're carrying the consequence of being so focused for all this length of time. And both things in my mind have their own traps because if you are so focused, then your attention is pointed so much in one direction, you have no field of vision. But if your field of vision so diffuse that you don't get to know anything deeply, then that carries with it its own risk. And so when I listen to you talk about like society's conditioning of us, in my mind, it's easier to deal with people if there's uh, easy steps. Do this, then do this, then do this, because they're easily managed. And by the way, I think it's easier to live like that. But then once you step outside of it and you go, listen, you have to, if your imagination extends that, like, well, how is it that you really want to be? That's a hard question. Like, do you really want to be peaceful? Well, what do you have to give up? And then what do you have to accept? You have to drop some things and pick some things up. And those are subtle, difficult things because sometimes you drop something you should be carrying, and sometimes you're carrying something that you should be dropping. Those are wisdom things. That's why I think, the traditions of religion and spiritual discipline, all that have their place because they give you at least a direction to begin looking. When you think about somebody listening to you, they don't really know what to do. They don't even know what they want to do, but they're inclined to kind of understand more what you're saying. What's a small thing that they could do to move themselves along your vision of like understanding their lives beyond the distracted conditioning of you know, their psychology or whatever you want to say?
I always like to say, just to slow things down a little bit.
Yeah.
We have more time than we think that we do.
Hmm.
Um, and to just slow things down and just try for a minute to just chill with yourself,
Hmm.
see what you think, see what's going on in there.
Yeah.
Um, Start small. Everything, journey of 1,000 miles, right? First
Right.
step.
Yeah.
So I think I would say just start. I think just, it's like we have this messy room, this dirty house or whatever. Like we got to clean it up. We don't know where to start. So we just sit there with it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if we start picking up, it takes a couple hours. We're done cleaning our room
Yeah.
or cleaning the
Yeah.
house or whatever. Yeah. We're the same way. Our mind, body, soul is the same thing.
Yeah.
So I would say like start nibbling at it. start having grace for yourself,
Yeah, nice.
self-love, love yourself. Like start with you and say, today I'm gonna love myself all day. And just do it for a whole day. Do it for half a day and then do it again.
Yeah.
And that's this monumental thing over time.
Yeah, I mean, I love what you're saying. I think that a lot of the traditions, when you say like take a second, like they'll they'll just like, hey, pay attention to your breathing in, your breathing out. Like, let's just get down to the most basic of moments. I'm no longer Catholic, but I was raised Catholic, and there's a Catholic tradition that's a little esoteric called the Desert Fathers. And in my Catholic years, I studied the Desert Fathers for a period of time, and one of the things that reminded me as you're talking was one of their disciplines was like, when you go through your day, see how many times you say no to something. And it was an interesting experience because it was what they meant by that was like, how often are you creating an objection just because for whatever you don't want it to be like this? It's rainy, you don't want it to be rainy, you're saying no to the rain. And when you talk, and I say that because when you say, well, love yourself all day, and if you're someone that doesn't love yourself, like I think it might be like, well, what does that mean to do? And in my mind, like, how many things about yourself do you criticize through the day that you just maybe take a day off and like you don't, like, okay, I'll observe it, but I don't have to. For today, I'm not going to beat myself up about this one, whatever. I don't know. I mean, I'm not. I don't mean to put words in your mouth. I just think about my own
No,
translation of what
that's
you.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. 100%.
So let's say someone goes, man, I want to find this guy. I want to learn more about what he's got to say and maybe work with you. Where do they come? Where do they go get you? Where are you at?
Yeah, our main page website is kishar.org. That's KISHAR.org. And that's the entrance to our community. We have individual spiritual guidance coaching one-on-one. We have socials are there. We have a pretty cool YouTube channel that talks about some of this stuff.
Okay.
So that's where people can find us. Love for them to come talk to us.
The YouTube channel, is same name? What's the,
The YouTube is at Peace on Your Journey,
okay, Peace on Your
and
Journey.
that's the YouTube channel that we use. So yeah, it's a pretty cool place, and we're a nonprofit. Any money that comes into the organization gets put back into the membership. We don't take salaries or anything like that. So
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, John, thank you for spending time with us, man. It's a pleasure for you to be so generous and talk to us about your journey, and thank you for helping people who need it because it's important work.
I love your podcasts. I love
Uh,
everything from your backdrop to the things you say, and what a great conversation. So thank you so much for having me on. I really do appreciate it.
the pleasure was all mine. Well, today's modern revolutionary, John Lawyer, he's doing things important in the world. He's bringing his ideas and his thoughts and his passion to us, and he's moving all of us forward. I think it's something that all of us should take some time to go learn about. But I also hope that it's inspiration for you, that whatever you're passionate about, you're thinking about, that you bring your thoughts and feelings to the world, your ideas, because the modern revolution needs us all.